Did Henry VII steal the throne, and if so, does that mean that the Tudors weren't the rightful rulers of England, and that Henry's descendants shouldn't wear the crown today? If that's the case, then who is the rightful king of the United Kingdom? It's a complex debate which involves the laws of blood claims, the rights of conquerors, and the belief, which was enshrined in UK law until 2013, that women are somehow inferior to men when it comes to holding the throne. But here on History Calling, we love a good debate. So let's get into it. Let's start with how a Welshman, Henry Tudor, formerly the Earl of Richmond, came to be King of England in the first place. Henry was never destined to be monarch. He did have a trickle of English royal blood through his mother, Lady Margaret Beaufort, who was a descendant of Edward III via his third son, John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, but this line had originally been illegitimate, and even when it was legitimised in 1397, everyone on it was still barred from inheriting the throne. Instead, throughout the 15th century, the crown was bouncing back and forth like a ping-pong ball between two other branches of the vast Plantagenet clan. Sometimes it was held by the descendants of Edward III's second and fourth sons, known as the Yorks, and highlighted here in white. Sometimes it was held by John of Gaunt's fully legitimate descendants, known as the Lancastrians, and highlighted here in red. By 1485, though, these two warring factions had nearly wiped each other out in the conflict now known as the Wars of the Roses, so named because of the white and red roses they sometimes used as emblems. The Lancastrian king, Henry VI, had been deposed by the Yorkist king, Edward IV, not once, but twice, and after the second deposition in 1471, Henry had mysteriously died in the Tower of London. His only son was also dead by that point, and so Edward IV now seemed to have no further rivals for the throne except potentially his own brothers, George, Duke of Clarence, and Richard, Duke of Gloucester. It also meant that despite his family's historic illegitimacy, Henry Tudor was now the senior male Lancastrian still alive. Barely a teenager at this point, he soon fled to mainland Europe to escape the Yorkist king's wrath, and Edward spent the next few years dealing with his treasonous brother George, who kept trying to depose him. The situation was seemingly settled once and for all when Edward had George executed by drowning in 1478, but Clarence left behind two children, Edward, Earl of Warwick, and Lady Margaret, later Countess of Salisbury, who we'll be talking about later. For now, though, just bear in mind that their father's attainder had stripped him and his heirs of all his titles, possessions, and hereditaments, which can be, and was, read as stripping them of their rights of inheritance to the crown as well. Now, Edward IV had two sons by his queen Elizabeth Woodville. These were Edward, Prince of Wales, and Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York. Nearly every male in this story is called Edward, Richard, or Henry, but I'll do my best to help you keep up. When King Edward died in April 1483, the new Edward V was only 12 years old, and therefore in need of a protector to rule England for him. His mother wanted her family to control him, while his paternal uncle, Richard of Gloucester, who up until this point I have to say had always been steadfastly loyal to his brother, believed that the job should go to him. After a tussle for power, Gloucester came out on top and managed to get both boys in his custody, while Elizabeth and her daughters stayed in sanctuary in Westminster Abbey. The young Edward V and his brother were placed in the Tower of London. Then Gloucester, despite that lifetime of loyalty I just mentioned, suddenly declared that actually his brother Edward and sister-in-law Elizabeth had never been lawfully married, all their children were illegitimate, and as his niece and nephew from his older brother George were barred from inheriting, he, Gloucester, was therefore the rightful king. The boys in the tower were never seen again, and if you watch my video all about their disappearance, you can hear about their possible fates. But what did all this mean for Henry Tudor, now all grown up but still in France? Well, it meant that quite suddenly there were far fewer people to get through if he ever wanted to try for the crown himself, and try he did in the autumn of 1483, when it became clear to all, including the ex-Queen Elizabeth, that her sons were most likely dead. This attempt failed, but in 1485 Henry was back, and this time he was victorious. At the Battle of Bosworth on the 22nd of August, he and his forces defeated and killed the now childless Richard, who had lost his only son earlier in the year. Henry took the throne as Henry VII, and in January 1486 he married Edward IV's oldest daughter, Elizabeth of York. This alliance united the Lancaster and York lines, and every monarch since who has ruled over England, then eventually a combination of England, including Wales, Ireland and Scotland, has been descended from this couple. But now we come to the central question of this video, and it's something I frequently see people arguing about in the comments under my other videos on the Wars of the Roses and the Tudors. Was Henry VII the rightful ruler of England, or should the crown have gone elsewhere? And if he wasn't a legitimate king, then what does that mean for the succession from 1485 all the way down to the present day? The whole crux of this argument pivots on our understanding of what constituted a valid means of taking the throne, who was allowed to hold it, and ultimately whether force trumps blood and male trumps female. Generally speaking, there were three ways of getting the crown: blood inheritance, conquest, and in rare cases by Act of Parliament. Some people also had a combination of these factors. Henry VII's claim was founded on conquest. He had defeated the previous king and as such was now entitled to that king's realm. This was not a new concept. William the Conqueror got his name for doing exactly the same thing, and Henry IV, Edward IV and Richard III all did something very similar, and those are just a few examples from what was then recent history. Now, some of these men had also had Parliament ratify what they'd done, and its MPs likewise supported Henry VII as the new king, vesting the crown in him and his lawfully begotten heirs during the first Parliament of his reign, and specifically stating that it belonged to no other. Still, he didn't have a strong blood claim on the crown, but his wife did. In fact, had all this not happened in the 15th century, when women's rights to the throne were barely acknowledged, if at all, then I think Elizabeth of York might have been able to get an army together and taken the throne in her own right as Elizabeth I. By marrying her, Henry Tudor ensured that his children had the trifecta. Their father had won the throne, their mother was the Yorkist heiress, and Parliament had signed off on the whole situation. So why do people still argue that the Tudors shouldn't have held the crown, and nor should all the later royal houses who claim Henry and Elizabeth as their ancestors? Well, I think it all comes down to the fact that some people don't recognise all three of the ways of taking the crown that I just mentioned. They favour a legitimate blood claim and a legitimate blood claim only, and as such, I'll often see the assertion that the quote-unquote real monarch today is a descendant of Margaret, Countess of Salisbury. Her brother, the Earl of Warwick, died without issue, which is why we aren't discussing him any further. This is because they view Elizabeth of York as illegitimate. Now, it's true that she and all her siblings were declared as such by their uncle Richard III. However, Henry VII had this reversed before he married her, and in any case, the whole claim rested on a completely unproven accusation that her parents, Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville, had been bigamously married. In order to argue that the Salisbury line, as I'm going to call it, still has a better claim than those descended from Elizabeth of York, you need to get into the very murky territory of cherry-picking which laws you want to follow. If you're prepared to set aside the Act of Attainder against Lady Salisbury's father, George Duke of Clarence, which stripped his children of their inheritance rights, and the 1485 Act of Parliament, which confirmed Henry VII as king and his legitimate children as his heirs, then why are you determined that the Act of Parliament delegitimising Elizabeth of York stands, even though it was revoked within a couple of years? Just to mess things up even further, there's also a contingent who'll argue that Elizabeth of York was illegitimate, the Salisbury line was and still is ineligible for the throne, and the people we should be looking at instead are the descendants of Richard's sisters, Anne, Duchess of Exeter, and Elizabeth, Duchess of Suffolk. Their argument is bolstered by the fact that this is exactly where Richard looked after his own son died in 1485. He named his nephew, the Earl of Lincoln, who was the Duchess of Suffolk's son, as his heir, despite the fact that Elizabeth herself was still alive, and Anne, who was by then deceased, was the older sister, which you might think would have made her only surviving child the senior heir. This child was a girl, though, and Richard, of course, wanted to leave the throne to a boy. That's what bumped Lincoln up the list. Now, the Duchess of Suffolk's line has long since died out, but the Duchess of Exeter still has descendants alive today, and it was some of them who provided DNA back in 2012 to confirm the identity of Richard's remains. So do they have a claim? Well, to those that say they do, I would counter by pointing out that you're still hitting a lot of the same problems as before. You have to ignore Henry Tudor's claim by conquest. You have to ignore the fact that Princess Elizabeth of York was re-legitimised and that the reason given for declaring her illegitimate was never proven. And you have to ignore that Henry VII was accepted as king by Parliament and the succession vested in his heirs and his heirs alone. Before we get to the next problem with discounting Henry VII's rights, if you're enjoying this content, please remember to give the video a thumbs up and tap that subscribe button with the notification bell switched on so that YouTube lets you know every time I upload a video or post on my community tab. You can also find me over on Instagram, where I post at least once a week, and on Patreon, where I share bonus material including early access to ad-free videos, mini podcasts and blog posts. As always, a big thank you to everyone who already supports me on that platform, as well as to those of you who make one-off donations to the channel using the thanks button underneath videos. Another big problem is that if you're never prepared to recognise a monarch like Henry VII, who took the throne by conquest, or their descendants, then we should be looking, at the very least, for the descendants of the Anglo-Saxon kings, because as I pointed out a minute ago, absolutely everyone who has held or put in a claim for the English throne since 1066 has been descended from a conqueror, William the Conqueror to be precise. By ignoring conquest, you open up a whole can of worms and render it all but impossible to ever select a true monarch. The English, Scottish and British successions have all been built upon the effects of occasional conquests. It's impossible to unpick all of that now, and would have been so in the 15th century as well. So where do I stand on Henry VII and the rights of his successors? Well, personally, I do believe that historically you can take the throne by conquest. It's not something that I necessarily think would be recognised today, but we're not talking about modern times, although in other places in the world, governments do occasionally come to power nowadays via violent political coups, which is the 21st century version of conquest. In medieval and early modern England, what made you the monarch was being able to get the throne and then hold on to it. In an ideal world, you'd accomplish this thanks to male primogeniture, which basically favours men over women and older siblings over younger. But it's not always an ideal world. I also think that once you've taken the throne by conquest, you've hit the reset button on the line of succession. The heirs are now your descendants, unless, of course, you or they are conquered too. I therefore don't think it matters how good or bad the claims of Margaret of Salisbury and Elizabeth of York and Anne of Exeter were. All that mattered was that Henry VII had won the crown, was able to keep it, and had parliamentary support, all of which he did. His marriage to Elizabeth made his conquest easier to stomach for many people, as they knew his children would be the grandchildren of Edward IV, and it also ensured that she couldn't marry elsewhere and produce a separate line which might seek to rival his. But he didn't need her to be king, or to pass the throne to his children. In fact, he'd already been king for about 5 months before their wedding, and the act which granted the crown to his heirs didn't specify who their mother had to be. Henry could have married a scullery maid. Their subsequent offspring would still have been in the line of succession. But what about what happened after Henry VII died? For as you probably know, his son, Henry VIII, struggled to produce a legitimate son of his own, and had all kinds of problems sorting out the succession. This is where Parliament becomes even more important. By the Act of Succession passed during the 1543-44 parliamentary session, Henry VIII was allowed to designate his own heirs, and in doing so, he ignored the rules of legitimate blood claims and even seniority of birth. His two daughters, Mary and Elizabeth Tudor, were both legally illegitimate, but he put them into the succession anyway, after their brother Edward VI. He then said that if all three died childless, the throne should go to the descendants of his younger sister, Mary Tudor Brandon, not his elder sister, Margaret, Queen of Scotland. In the event, though, one part of Mary's line was declared illegitimate and the other was simply overlooked, so that it was Margaret's descendant, James VI of Scotland, aka James I of England, who took the crown in 1603, totally bypassing Henry's wishes as ratified by Parliament. I think this just goes to show that the whole system of male primogeniture and the idea that heirs to the throne have to be recognised as having been legitimately born or even recognised by MPs is flexible. To paraphrase a line from Pirates of the Caribbean, these rules are more like guidelines. When it suits, they can and have been set aside. Increasingly, the system was becoming reliant on a combination of blood, parliamentary recognition and the occasional conquest, but always with the option of making a change when it suited, and this pattern continued during the 17th century. In 1649, James's son, Charles I, was executed, and the monarchy abolished in what I would term another type of conquest, this time by the parliamentarians. The Republican experiment didn't last, though, and the monarchy was restored in 1660 with the crown given to Charles I's son, Charles II. It's the word given which is the important one here. Charles II actually claimed to be king from the moment his father died in 1649, but saying it didn't make it so, even though he did have the best blood claim on it. Instead, nowadays his reign is measured from 1660. To be a monarch on anything more than paper, you need to be recognised as such by most of your people. You need to be able to live in your kingdom with access to all the accoutrements of monarchy, like castles, palaces, lands, crown jewels, and a massive income. You need to be able to exercise the power of monarchy, whatever that happens to mean at any given time. And Charles II didn't meet any of these requirements until 1660. Furthermore, other than being able to live in the UK, none of the alternate monarchs that some people claim should have the throne today because they're descended from Lady Salisbury or Anne of Exeter meet these requirements either. This clash between blood rights, legal rights, and the reality of the situation on the ground was to prove a long-term problem for the Stuarts. In 1688, the Glorious Revolution occurred, when Charles II's brother, the Catholic James II, was ousted after his second wife gave birth to a son, and it looked as though a new Catholic dynasty was emerging. After James, his queen, and their baby fled England, Parliament decided that he had abdicated, even though he hadn't, and that the throne was vacant. They then offered the crown to James's Protestant son-in-law/nephew and his daughter, William III and Mary II. King James was still alive, and so was his legitimate son, the Prince of Wales, but it wasn't the little prince who was given the throne. Although William had cleared a path for himself to the crown by invading England with an army, having been invited to do so, it should be said, the succession was ultimately ratified in 1689 by MPs, who facilitated this joint monarchy through legislation called the Bill of Rights. It was actually William's wife who had the better claim to the throne, followed by her sister Anne and Anne's children, but William threatened to up sticks and go back to Holland if he wasn't made king regnant, and Mary supported him. Years later, when it became clear that they would have no children and that Anne would have no surviving children, MPs stepped in yet again to block any Catholic from inheriting the throne. The succession was now vested in the Hanoverians, who were descended from the daughter of James VI of Scotland/First of England. They therefore got the throne without having to conquer the British Isles and without having the best blood claim on it, an exceptionally unusual situation. It was a bit of a struggle to hold on to this gift, though. James II and his descendants undoubtedly had a better blood claim, and they were still alive and insisting that they were the rightful monarchs. They and their supporters, known as the Jacobites, repeatedly tried to retake the throne, and there were serious uprisings against Hanoverian rule in 1715 and 1745. The situation was only resolved when the legitimate Jacobite line eventually died out. Just like Charles II between 1649 and 1660, I think this whole situation is a perfect example of why a good blood claim does not automatically make you the monarch. In both cases, foreign powers recognised the would-be kings as monarchs, but it didn't enable them to actually go back to England and rule, and history does not recognise the reigns of exiles who have been replaced by someone else. Furthermore, I would argue that the re-establishment of the monarchy in 1660, the Glorious Revolution of 1688, and the Act of Settlement of 1701, which made the Hanoverians the heirs, were all cases of hard resets to the line of succession. Yes, Charles II, William III, Mary II, and the Hanoverians can all trace their ancestry to Henry Tudor and Elizabeth of York. But in each case, if someone else had been chosen to take the throne, a descendant of Lady Salisbury for instance, and had had the support of Parliament, the aristocracy and the populace at large, there's not a whole lot that any of these other claimants could have done about it. I would argue that the current monarch doesn't just hold the crown because they descend from Henry and Elizabeth, though that is important, but because their ancestors were permitted to hold it by much later Acts of Parliament. This line of thought is also present on the British monarchy's website, which states that the succession to the throne is regulated not only through descent, but also by parliamentary statute. The basis for the succession was determined in the constitutional developments of the 17th century, which culminated in the Bill of Rights 1689 and the Act of Settlement 1701. It therefore came to be established not only that the sovereign rules through Parliament, but that the succession to the throne can be regulated by Parliament, and that a sovereign can be deprived of his or her title through misgovernment. The Act of Settlement confirmed that it was for Parliament to determine the title to the throne. This should put pay to the idea, once and for all, that there is a real monarch out there who isn't Charles III. Unless they are chosen to be king or queen by Parliament, or have descended by male primogeniture from someone who was chosen by MPs, then since 1701 at the latest, it hasn't really mattered who their ancestors were. Just to hammer home that it is Parliament who ultimately chooses the monarch nowadays, I'm going to finish by discussing its most recent change to the rules of succession via the Succession to the Crown Act of 2013, though it didn't actually come into force until 2015. This act did away with male primogeniture and also revoked the ban on heirs to the throne marrying Catholics, although the ban on Catholics actually being the monarch still stands. Now, older siblings always outrank younger, no matter their gender, and thus Princess Charlotte is higher in the line of succession than her younger brother, Prince Louis. Had she been born a generation earlier, his birth would have pushed her down the list, just as Princess Anne was displaced by the births of her two younger brothers, Princes Andrew and Edward. Of course, male primogeniture is still a way of life for the aristocracy. You don't typically see the oldest daughter of a duke becoming a duchess, for instance, even if she's his firstborn legitimate child, but I wonder if that won't be altered too as time wears on. So those are my thoughts on the legality of the Tudors' claim to the throne and that of all their descendants. But what do you make of all this? Do you think Henry VII was a legitimate king and that the Windsors' claim to the throne is good? Or do you think that the crown should have gone elsewhere at some point? Let me know in the comments below, and until next time, keep learning.